Have you ever felt like something just isn't right in your life, but you can't put your finger on it? Maybe you've experienced repeated difficulties, confusion, or setbacks, and yet you continue on the same path, wondering why God seems silent. Often, the answer isn't that God isn't speaking, it's that we are ignoring His warnings without even realizing it. God communicates with us in many ways, through the Bible, through circumstances, through the advice of wise believers, and even through the quiet nudges of our conscience. The problem is, we live in a noisy world. Distractions, busy schedules, and our own desires can easily drown out these divine signals. When we fail to pay attention, we unintentionally walk into situations that could have been avoided. Ignoring God's warnings is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle, like continuing a bad habit despite knowing it's harmful, or choosing comfort over obedience. These small choices may seem harmless, but over time, they shape our spiritual lives and create a distance between us and God. Just as a car left off the road will eventually run into trouble, ignoring God's guidance gradually leads us into difficulties. The enemy is well aware of this. Satan loves it when believers miss the small warnings because these little blind spots give him leverage. A tiny seed of disobedience can grow into a pattern that blocks God's blessings, clouds our judgment, and even damages relationships. The Bible is full of examples where ignoring warnings led to consequences. Take Jonah, for instance. God warned Jonah to go to Nineveh and deliver his message. Jonah chose to run in the opposite direction. At first, he might have thought it was just a minor inconvenience to ignore God's plan, but eventually, he found himself in the belly of a great fish, facing the consequences of his disobedience. Similarly, we might receive warnings about unhealthy relationships, financial choices, or spiritual neglect. If we ignore them, we might face struggles that could have been prevented. So how can we recognize when God is trying to warn us? The first step is cultivating awareness. This begins with prayer, asking God to open our eyes to the areas of our life where we are walking in darkness. It also involves regularly reading Scripture because God often speaks through His Word, giving guidance and caution. Another way God warns us is through the influence of trusted believers, people who care for our spiritual growth and are willing to speak truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Ignoring such counsel is another way we miss God's warnings. Finally, understanding the spiritual consequences is crucial. When we dismiss God's nudges, we are not merely choosing a different path. We are inviting chaos into our lives. Problems escalate, relationships strain, and peace becomes elusive. But here's the good news: God's warnings are never meant to scare us. They are meant to protect us, guide us, and lead us to His best. Recognizing them is the first step toward walking in alignment with His plan. The moment we begin to notice and respond to these gentle warnings, we open ourselves to a life of clarity, favor, and spiritual growth. Remember, God doesn't shout in anger when we ignore Him. Most of the time, He whispers through circumstances, feelings, and the counsel of others. The key is to train our hearts and minds to listen and respond. Each small act of obedience strengthens our connection with Him and ensures that His blessings are not hindered. Ignoring God's warnings is a subtle trap, but awareness, prayer, and willingness to obey are the first steps in breaking free from it. When we choose to ignore God's warnings, even small ones, it may seem like nothing serious is happening at first. But over time, these choices have a profound impact on our spiritual lives. The danger lies in the fact that God's warnings are like signposts on the road of life. They are meant to guide us away from trouble and toward His purpose. Ignoring them doesn't just delay our blessings. It often leads us into unnecessary pain, frustration, and spiritual stagnation. The enemy knows this and takes advantage of every opportunity to keep believers blind to these subtle alerts. One of the most common ways we ignore God's guidance is by choosing comfort over obedience. We all have areas in our lives where following God's direction requires sacrifice, effort, or stepping into the unknown. Perhaps God nudges you to reconcile with someone you've been holding a grudge against, or to leave a situation that is spiritually dangerous. Instead of listening, we rationalize, "It's not a big deal," or "I'll deal with it later." These small postponements often escalate into bigger spiritual blockages. What seemed minor can grow into a pattern that hinders our prayer life, damages relationships, or even limits our potential to receive God's blessings. Another subtle trap is ignoring warnings through procrastination or distraction. We may feel God guiding us through an inner voice, a verse in the Bible, or advice from a trusted friend, yet our busy lives and distractions push us to postpone action. It's easy to think that one small delay won't matter, but God's timing is precise, and each ignored warning gives the enemy a foothold. Spiritual dryness, repeated failures, and feelings of distance from God often trace back to these ignored nudges. Proverbs 19:2 reminds us, "Desire without knowledge is not good. How much more will hasty feet miss the way?" Hasty choices, or ignoring gentle nudges, can create a chain reaction of problems. Ignoring God's warnings also dulls our spiritual sensitivity. Just like ignoring an alarm clock repeatedly makes us less likely to hear it, ignoring God's messages makes our hearts less responsive. We begin to rely on our own understanding and instincts rather than seeking His wisdom. This self-reliance can appear efficient, but it's spiritually dangerous. Satan loves to exploit our tendency to trust ourselves more than God. The more we ignore Him, the harder it becomes to hear His voice clearly in the future. There is also a relational and emotional cost to ignoring God's warnings. Often, the areas where God is nudging us involve people, maybe a friend, a family member, or a co-worker. Ignoring God's guidance in these relationships can lead to conflict, misunderstandings, or even broken bonds. Spiritually, we become more vulnerable to bitterness, resentment, and discouragement. The enemy knows that unresolved conflicts and bitterness are like cracks in a wall, easy points of entry for spiritual attacks. Yet, God's warnings are never meant to punish us. They are expressions of His love and care. He wants us to walk in safety, clarity, and blessing. Every warning we ignore is an opportunity to strengthen our faith and obedience. Responding to God's guidance, even in small ways, aligns us with His timing and plan. It builds trust, cultivates discernment, and strengthens our spiritual resilience. Each act of obedience is like adding a brick to a strong wall that protects us from the enemy's attacks and keeps our hearts receptive to God's blessings. The key takeaway is this: ignoring God's warnings doesn't just risk temporary setbacks, it opens doors for long-term consequences that could have been avoided. But the moment we start recognizing and responding to these nudges, even the smallest ones, we begin to walk in alignment with His purposes. Life becomes clearer, decisions easier, and the peace of God flows in a way that is impossible when we remain deaf to His guidance. It's one thing to understand that ignoring God's warnings is dangerous, but the next step is realizing how we do it unknowingly in our daily lives. Often, we think we're following God faithfully, praying, and reading the Bible regularly, yet somehow we miss His guidance. One reason is that we listen with our ears but not with our hearts. God speaks in subtle ways, through feelings, circumstances, or advice from others. If our heart is distracted by worry, fear, or busyness, His voice can easily go unheard. Another common way we ignore God is through rationalization. We tell ourselves it's not a big deal, or God will understand my choice. Maybe He nudges us to change a habit, confront a sin, or speak the truth in a difficult situation, but we delay. Rationalization makes us believe that postponement is harmless, when in reality, the delay weakens our spiritual discernment. Small ignored warnings add up, creating a spiritual fog that keeps us from seeing God's plan clearly. Distraction is another powerful tool of the enemy. Social media, endless tasks, entertainment, and even good things can clutter our minds. When we fill every moment with noise, there's little space left to hear God's quiet nudges. Even though He's always trying to speak, our hearts may be too busy to respond. That's why the Bible repeatedly encourages stillness and reflection. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Stillness helps us recognize His guidance, while distraction keeps us walking blindly. We also often ignore warnings because of pride. Pride whispers, "You've got this. You don't need God's guidance for this situation." This self-reliance makes us blind to the subtle signs He sends. Proverbs 3:5-6 reminds us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." When we depend solely on ourselves, we risk walking into difficulties that God was trying to prevent. Recognizing our limitations and submitting to God's wisdom is key to avoiding spiritual pitfalls. Now, let's talk about solutions. Step 1. Cultivate awareness. This means paying attention to your life and asking God regularly, Lord, are there areas I'm missing? Show me where I need to change. Prayer is not just about asking for things. It's about opening your heart to His direction. Step 2. Simplify your life. Reduce distractions and create space for quiet reflection, Bible reading, and listening. Even 10 minutes of focused prayer daily can make a tremendous difference. Step 3. Respond promptly when you feel God's nudge. Whether it's confronting a hidden sin, forgiving someone, or making a difficult choice, don't delay. Immediate action strengthens your spiritual sensitivity and opens doors for blessing. Another powerful tool is accountability. Surround yourself with trusted believers who can speak truth into your life. Often, God uses others to reinforce His warnings. When we ignore advice or correction, we are essentially ignoring His voice. But when we listen and act, we align ourselves with God's plan. This is how spiritual growth and protection begin. Remember, ignoring God's warnings is rarely intentional. Most of the time, it's a result of habit, distraction, or misunderstanding. The enemy counts on this, but God's grace is greater than our mistakes. Each time we notice a nudge, respond, and obey, we reverse the pattern and grow spiritually stronger. Over time, recognizing and responding to His guidance becomes second nature, and life begins to flow in His favor more than ever before. The truth is simple. Obedience to God's warnings is not restrictive. It is liberating. It shields you from unnecessary struggles, protects your relationships, and aligns your life with His promises. As you train your heart to listen, you will notice that doors begin to open, clarity replaces confusion, and peace fills spaces where anxiety once lived. God's warnings are always for our good, and choosing to respond is the key to walking in His blessing. Now that we understand how easy it is to ignore God's warnings and the subtle ways the enemy exploits that, it's time to focus on the solution: how to respond and live in alignment with God's plan. Responding to God's guidance is not just about avoiding trouble, it's about opening your life to His blessings, protection, and spiritual growth. Every warning God gives is a loving nudge to redirect us toward His purpose, not to punish us. Recognizing this truth changes our perspective. We begin to see His discipline and guidance as acts of love rather than restriction. The first step in responding is awareness combined with humility. Ask God daily to reveal areas in your life where you are missing His guidance. Pray, Lord, show me where I need to change. Help me hear your voice clearly. This simple yet consistent practice tunes your heart to His subtle nudges. Humility is key here because pride often makes us blind to our own mistakes. Proverbs 11:2 reminds us, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. By adopting a humble heart, we become sensitive to God's leading, making it easier to act on His warnings promptly. The second step is action without delay. When God nudges you to do something, even if it's uncomfortable or challenging, respond immediately. Waiting often leads to rationalization, procrastination, and ultimately spiritual stagnation. For example, God may prompt you to forgive someone who hurt you. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Forgive now, or perhaps He is calling you to confront a hidden sin or let go of a bad habit. Immediate obedience strengthens your faith, builds spiritual resilience, and allows God to work in ways that wouldn't be possible if we delay. The third step is daily spiritual disciplines. Reading the Bible, praying, meditating, and worshiping aren't just rituals. They are the tools that keep our hearts and minds in tune with God. Romans 10:17 says, "Faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ." Daily engagement with Scripture strengthens our ability to recognize God's warnings and understand His plan. It also helps us resist the distractions and subtle traps the enemy places in our path. Over time, these disciplines cultivate spiritual clarity, peace, and wisdom. Accountability is also essential. Surround yourself with fellow believers who can speak truth and provide guidance. God often uses others to reinforce His messages. Ignoring counsel from wise, trusted believers is often another way we unintentionally ignore God's warnings. By listening and acting on their advice, we stay aligned with His plan and avoid pitfalls that could have been prevented. Finally, let's talk about the spiritual rewards of responding faithfully. When we heed God's warnings, we experience clarity, peace, and favor. Life begins to flow more smoothly because we are walking in alignment with His purpose. Relationships improve, decisions become easier, and opportunities for blessing multiply. God's blessings are already prepared for us, but we cannot fully receive them if we ignore His guidance. Obedience opens doors that disobedience keeps closed. Here's the truth: God's warnings are never meant to harm you. They are meant to protect you, guide you, and draw you closer to Him. Each time you recognize a nudge and act on it, you strengthen your spiritual sensitivity, deepen your faith, and create space for His blessings to flow. It's never too late to start paying attention, responding faithfully, and realigning your life with His plan. As we close this message, I encourage you to take action today. Look for one area where you might have been ignoring God's guidance and make a conscious choice to obey. Share this message with someone who needs encouragement. Comment below, "God, I choose to listen and obey," and commit to being attentive to His voice daily. Remember the promise of Jeremiah 29:11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." God's warnings are part of those plans. They are not obstacles. They are protective gates that lead to His best for you. Start listening today, act with faith, and walk in the blessings He has already prepared.